Judge Marcus Williams has always upheld the law without question, until Mia Lewis, a struggling mother, stands before him charged with stealing food for her starving son. What seems like a simple case pushes Marcus to dig deeper into her family's past, uncovering a wrongful conviction that could destroy everything he's worked for. As Marcus risks his career to fight for justice, he faces powerful opposition. Will he be able to right the wrongs or lose everything in the process? Comment below with your thoughts. Can compassion and justice coexist? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow this gripping story to its powerful conclusion. Judge Marcus Williams sat high on the wooden bench of the Clarksville courthouse, his gavel resting on the desk beside him. The courtroom bustled with the quiet shuffling of feet, the murmuring of lawyers, and the rhythmic clacking of the clerk's keyboard. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, his face a mask of sternness, his demeanor cool and distant, as though he were sitting in an invisible bubble that separated him from the rest of the world. Over the years, Marcus had built a reputation that was both respected and feared. His rulings were methodical, unemotional, and always bound tightly to the law. People spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and dread. He had become known as a man who saw only two colors, black and white, and whose decisions never blurred into gray. As the morning's cases dragged on, Marcus felt the weight of each decision resting heavily on his shoulders, though he showed no sign of fatigue. It was always the same: drugs, theft, petty crimes that seemed endless. But his job wasn't to fix people's lives. It was to enforce the law, regardless of how harsh it might seem to those who stood before him. "Next case," Marcus called out, his voice firm and devoid of emotion. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and a woman in her early 30s shuffled forward, her steps slow, as if carrying an unseen burden. Her clothes were simple, worn but clean, and her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail. She stood before the judge's bench, her shoulders hunched in a way that spoke of a lifetime of struggle. Behind her, a little boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, clung to her hand. His eyes were wide, taking in the grandeur of the courtroom with a mix of awe and fear. "State your name for the record," the clerk said, her voice echoing in the near-empty room. "Mia Lewis," the woman replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus glanced at the file in front of him, scanning the details quickly. The charge was petty theft, an all-too common crime in this part of town, where poverty often drove people to desperate acts. "The defendant, Mia Lewis, is charged with the theft of goods from Miller's Market," the clerk read aloud, her voice steady and unfeeling. "How do you plead?" Mia's fingers tightened around the boy's hand, and for a moment she hesitated, her eyes darting toward her public defender, a lanky man with thinning hair. He gave her a slight nod. "Guilty," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Marcus looked up from the file, his sharp eyes focusing on the woman before him. There was nothing remarkable about her case. It was routine, like so many others he had presided over in the past. She was just another struggling, single mother, caught in the system's web, a small-time offender with little means to defend herself. But something about her posture, about the quiet desperation in her eyes, caught his attention. "What did you steal?" Marcus asked, his tone indifferent. The public defender stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, Mrs. Lewis took a small amount of expired goods, items that were set to be thrown away, from Miller's Market. They had no monetary value, and the store was planning to discard them." "Expired goods?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. Mia finally found her voice, though it was thin and fragile. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, looking down at her feet. "My son, we didn't have any food at home." Before Marcus could respond, a small voice rang out in the courtroom, clear and innocent, cutting through the formal proceedings like a knife. "We were hungry." The boy stepped forward, his big brown eyes fixed on the judge. He wore a faded, oversized coat that looked like it had been passed down through several hands. His face was pale, his cheeks hollow, and there was a vulnerability in his gaze that made the room hold its breath. "We didn't eat for 2 days," the boy added, his voice trembling slightly. "Mommy tried, but we didn't have anything." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet activity, fell silent. All eyes turned toward the boy, and Marcus felt a strange tightening in his chest. It wasn't unusual for defendants to appeal to emotion in court. It wasn't even unusual for children to be present when their parents stood trial. But this is different. Marcus stared at the boy, unsure of how to react. He could see the dark circles under the child's eyes, the way his small frame seemed lost inside the oversized coat. The boy's words echoed in Marcus's mind, tugging at something deep within him. "Your Honor," the public defender interjected softly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Lewis had a difficult time. Her husband, James Lewis, was imprisoned 2 years ago under questionable circumstances. She's been raising her son, Eli, on her own ever since. The theft was a result of desperation, not malice. Mia stood quietly, her head bowed, as if ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. Her grip on Eli's hand tightened, and Marcus could see the exhaustion etched into her features. The kind of exhaustion that went beyond sleepless nights, beyond hunger. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle against life itself. Judge Marcus Williams leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The law was clear on theft, no matter the circumstances. But for the first time in a long time, he felt conflicted. His instincts told him to follow protocol, to issue a fine or even a short jail sentence for Mia. After all, theft was theft. The law didn't care about the reasons behind it. But then there was the boy, Eli, who stood there, looking up at him with those wide, hopeful eyes. And there was Mia, whose silence spoke louder than any plea for mercy. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had built his career on upholding the law, on maintaining order and fairness. But what if fairness wasn't the same as justice? What if, just this once, he had to look beyond the rules and see the people standing in front of him? "We'll take a short recess," Marcus announced abruptly, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. The courtroom stirred with murmurs of confusion as Marcus stood and exited through the side door, leaving the rest of the court in stunned silence. The corridors of the courthouse were cool and dimly lit, the marble floors echoing with the sound of Marcus's footsteps as he walked briskly toward the break room. His mind was a blur of thoughts, each one pulling him in a different direction. He had never wavered in his judgments before, never allowed emotion to cloud his decisions. But that boy's voice, it haunted him. Marcus entered the small, nearly empty break room and poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. The taste was bitter, but it didn't matter. He needed a moment to collect himself, to regain the composure that had slipped away the moment Eli spoke. For years, Marcus had prided himself on his ability to distance himself from the people in his courtroom. It wasn't his job to feel for them. It was his job to interpret the law. But something about Mia's case had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't expected. He thought back to the files he had scanned earlier. Mia's story was a tragic one, but not unique. Her husband, James Lewis, had been imprisoned 2 years ago for armed robbery. Marcus vaguely remembered the case. James had claimed innocence, but the evidence had been enough to convict him. Mia had been left to raise their son on her own, scraping by on whatever meager work she could find. As he stood in the break room, Marcus found himself wondering, what if James had been innocent? What if Mia had been driven to this point not by choice, but by a system that had failed her? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This wasn't his problem to solve. It wasn't his job to question the past. His duty was to handle the case in front of him and deliver a fair sentence. But as he looked down at the coffee swirling in his cup, the image of Eli's face came back to him, those wide, innocent eyes staring up at him, pleading for mercy in a way words never could. With a sigh, Marcus set the cup down and left the break room. There was no escaping what he had to do. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Marcus resumed his seat at the bench. The court clerk called the room back to order, and Mia stood once again in front of him, her son clutching her hand. The air felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for something they couldn't quite name. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mrs. Lewis, I understand the difficult circumstances you find yourself in," he began, his voice steady but softer than before. "But the law is clear when it comes to theft, regardless of the reason. You've pled guilty, and the penalty for theft can include fines or even imprisonment. Mia's shoulders slumped, her face falling as if the weight of the world had finally crushed her. Eli looked up at Marcus, his face filled with fear and confusion. The boy didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could sense his mother's pain, and it scared him. Marcus felt his heart squeeze painfully in his chest. He glanced down at the gavel, his fingers brushing its handle. This was the moment of decision, the moment when he would either enforce the law as it was written or make a choice that went against everything he had built his career on. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, without another word, Marcus stood, walked down from the bench, and approached Mia. He stopped in front of her, and for the first time, the cold distance between judge and defendant disappeared. He held out a brown paper bag. "I thought you might be hungry," Marcus said quietly, handing the bag to Mia. Mia's eyes widened in disbelief as she took the bag, her hands trembling. Inside were 2 sandwiches, apples, and bottles of water. She blinked rapidly, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor." Eli, seeing the food, brightened immediately. "Can we eat it now?" he asked, his eyes darting between Marcus and his mother. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, of course, please eat." The room remained hushed as Mia carefully unwrapped a sandwich for Eli, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Eli took a big bite, his eyes closing in contentment as he chewed. "It's good," he said, his voice muffled but happy. Mia ate more slowly, her eyes never leaving Marcus as she savored each bite. There was a mix of gratitude and weariness in her gaze, as if she couldn't help but wonder what this unexpected compassion might mean for her case. As mother and son ate, Marcus returned to his seat on the bench, his expression softened by a growing sense of responsibility. The courtroom watched in stunned silence, unsure of what would happen next. That night, as Marcus sat in his quiet study, the echoes of the day's events lingered in his mind. His wife, Julia, had already gone to bed, but Marcus couldn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him, the case of Mia Lewis. His mind wandered back to his own childhood, something he rarely allowed himself to think about. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood, raised by a single mother who had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. There had been nights when the fridge was empty and Marcus had gone to bed hungry, but his mother had always found a way to get by, no matter how hard things had been. He hadn't thought about those days in years. He had worked so hard to escape them, to build a life where he never had to worry about hunger or bills. But now, sitting in his comfortable home, Marcus felt a strange pang of guilt. He had climbed out of that life, but what about the people who couldn't? What about Mia and Eli? He flipped through the case file, skimming the details of James Lewis's trial. There were inconsistencies in the witness statements, gaps in the evidence that made Marcus uneasy. The more he read, the more he began to wonder, had James been wrongfully convicted? Had Mia been left to fend for herself because of a mistake? Or worse, because of a system that didn't care enough to get it right? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. It was Alice, his clerk. "Marcus," she said, her voice gentle, "I heard about today. Are you okay?" Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Alice. Something about this case, it doesn't sit right with me." "I've never seen you call for a recess like that," Alice said, her tone full of concern. "What's going on?" Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to explain the conflict raging inside him. "There's a child, Alice. A little boy. He said he was hungry and I—" His voice trailed off as he realized how strange it sounded, how uncharacteristic his behavior had been. But Alice understood. "It's not wrong to care, Marcus," she said softly. "You've been a judge for a long time, but that doesn't mean you have to stop being human." After they hung up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had always believed that the law was black and white, that there was a clear line between right and wrong. But now, as he thought about Mia and Eli, that line seemed to blur. The next morning, the town of Clarksville buzzed with whispers about Judge Williams. News of his unexpected act of kindness in the courtroom had spread like wildfire, and people couldn't stop talking about it. At the local diner where Mia had once worked, the regulars gathered over their morning coffee, exchanging stories and speculation. "I heard Judge Williams gave her food," said Betty, the town's most notorious gossip, her voice hushed but excited. "Right there in the middle of the courtroom. Can you believe that?" Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher, shook her head in disbelief. "I've never known him to show compassion like that. Maybe he's getting soft in his old age." Tom, the owner of the hardware store, snorted. "Soft? I don't know about that. Sounds more like he's meddling in things he shouldn't be. Judges are supposed to enforce the law, not play social worker." The conversation shifted as more people weighed in, some defending Marcus's actions, others criticizing him for stepping outside the bounds of his role. But not everyone in Clarksville was as eager to pass judgment. At the courthouse, Marcus's colleagues watched him with wary eyes. He could feel their judgment in the way they looked at him, the way they avoided conversation whenever he walked by. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with his old friend and fellow judge, Harold Harper, over lunch. Harper, a man as stern as Marcus but less inclined to involve himself in personal matters, had been a close confidant for years. But today, Harper's usual camaraderie was tinged with concern. "Marcus, I heard about the Lewis case," Harper began, his brow furrowed. "What were you thinking?" Marcus took a deep breath, unsure of how to explain the growing conflict inside him. "I wasn't thinking, Harold. I was feeling." Harper raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Feeling? Since when do you let your feelings get in the way of the law?" Marcus shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You weren't there. You didn't see the boy, Eli. He's just a child, Harold, a child who's hungry. How can I stand there and pass judgment without considering that?" "That's not your job, Marcus," Harper said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your job is to enforce the law. You start letting emotions get in the way, and you'll lose sight of what's right." "What's right?" Marcus scoffed, his voice rising. "Is it right to punish a mother for trying to feed her child? Is it right to turn a blind eye to the fact that our system is failing people like Mia every day?" Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Look, I get it. You care, and that's not a bad thing. But you've got to be careful, Marcus. If you keep going down this road, you're going to find yourself in trouble." "I know," Marcus replied quietly. "But what if this is the road I'm supposed to be on?" Harper didn't have an answer, and the conversation lapsed into silence. As Marcus left the diner that afternoon, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had always followed the rules, always stayed within the boundaries of the law. But now, for the first time in his career, he was questioning those boundaries, and he wasn't sure where that would lead him. It had been days since the Lewis case had first shaken Judge Marcus Williams. His nights had been filled with restless dreams. Images of Eli's innocent face and Mia's exhausted eyes haunted him. He could no longer simply dismiss their plight. Something about this case wouldn't let him go. It was early morning, and the sky was still dark when Marcus sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the file he had pulled from the courthouse archives. The trial of James Lewis had taken place 2 years ago, and while the case seemed straightforward at first glance, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. There were discrepancies in the testimonies, contradictions between what the witnesses had claimed to see and what the evidence suggested. The gun used in the robbery hadn't been recovered, and the store owner's description of the suspect had been vague at best. Yet somehow James had been convicted. The legal process, once so clear in Marcus's mind, now felt murky and unreliable. He had always trusted that the system would do its job, that justice would prevail in the end. But as he sat there in the pre-dawn quiet, Marcus found himself questioning everything he had once believed. His wife, Julia, entered the kitchen, still in her bathrobe. She looked at Marcus, her brow furrowing in concern. "You're up early again," she said softly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Is it about that case?" Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the file. "I can't stop thinking about it. Something's wrong here, Julia. I've gone through the trial records, and there are so many things that don't add up." Julia sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug. "Marcus, you've been a judge for a long time. You know how the system works. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but that doesn't mean you can fix everything." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "But this isn't just about a mistake in the system. This is about a family, a child who's growing up without his father. And the more I look at this case, the more I think James might be innocent." Julia frowned, her concern deepening. "What are you going to do?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm not sure, but I can't just walk away from this." Later that day, Marcus made a call that he knew could change everything. "Sarah, it's Marcus," he said as soon as the line connected. "I need your help." Sarah Donovan, his old law school friend and a defense attorney known for fighting wrongful convictions, was surprised to hear from him. They hadn't worked together in years, and though they had kept in touch, Marcus had always stayed firmly on the side of the law. "Marcus, this is unexpected," Sarah replied, her tone curious. "What's going on?" Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to explain the mess of emotions and doubts that had been building inside him. "There's a case I need you to look at. James Lewis. He was convicted 2 years ago for armed robbery. I went through the trial records and something's not right." Sarah listened intently as Marcus laid out the details of the case. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus," Sarah said slowly, "you know this isn't just a casual favor. If I dig into this and find something, we're talking about reopening a case that's already been decided. It's going to ruffle feathers, especially if it turns out you're right." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice firm, "but I can't ignore this. James might be innocent, and if that's true, we owe it to him to find out." Sarah was quiet for another moment, then she sighed. "All right, send me everything you have. I'll look into it." While Marcus and Sarah worked behind the scenes, Mia's life continued to unravel. She had lost her job at the diner after her arrest, and the bills were piling up faster than she could manage. Their apartment, already small and cramped, now felt like a prison as Mia struggled to provide for Eli. One evening, after another long day of fruitless job hunting, Mia sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she counted out the last few dollars she had. There wasn't enough for rent, let alone groceries. And while Marcus's small act of kindness in the courtroom had given her hope, that hope was fading fast. Eli, unaware of the full weight of their circumstances, sat nearby, working on a drawing. He had always been a quiet child, but since James had been taken away, he had become even more withdrawn. The only time Mia saw him light up was when he talked about his father. "Mom, can we visit Dad soon?" Eli asked, his eyes wide with innocence. Mia's heart clenched. She hadn't been able to visit James in weeks. The cost of traveling to the prison was too high, and every time she told Eli they couldn't go, his face would fall in that heartbreaking way that made her feel like the worst mother in the world. "Soon, baby," Mia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll see him soon." Eli nodded, satisfied with her answer for now, and went back to his drawing. But Mia knew she couldn't keep lying to him. She couldn't keep pretending that everything would be okay when, in reality, she had no idea how they were going to survive. Later that night, Mia sat in the darkened living room, staring blankly at the wall. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, frustration, and exhaustion. She had tried so hard to hold everything together, but it felt like the world was conspiring against her. Every door she knocked on was slammed shut, every opportunity ripped away before she could grasp it. The sound of a soft knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Mia stood slowly, her heart racing as she made her way to the door, unsure of who could be visiting so late. When she opened it, she found Judge Marcus Williams standing on the doorstep, his expression unreadable. "Judge Williams," Mia said, her voice filled with surprise. What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I know things have been difficult since the trial, and I've been thinking a lot about your husband's case." Mia's eyes widened, hope flickering in her chest. "You're looking into James's case?" Marcus nodded, his face serious. "Yes, I've been reviewing the trial records, and I have reason to believe there may have been a mistake. I'm working with an attorney to investigate further, but I can't make any promises yet." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes as she tried to process what Marcus was saying. For so long, she had felt like no one cared. Like James's life, their family's life, didn't matter to anyone. But now, for the first time in years, someone was fighting for them. "Thank you," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Marcus replied. Just know that you're not alone in this. As Marcus left, Mia stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. A few weeks passed, and Marcus and Sarah worked tirelessly to uncover the truth about James's conviction. The deeper they dug, the more they found. Evidence that had been overlooked, witnesses whose statements had been altered, and a prosecutor who had pushed for a conviction despite the lack of solid proof. But with each new discovery, Marcus knew they were walking a dangerous line. One afternoon, as Marcus was leaving the courthouse, he received an unexpected call from Gregory Fisher, the district attorney who had prosecuted James's case. Marcus, Fisher began, his voice calm but cold, I hear you've been stirring up trouble, looking into cases that have already been closed. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. I'm doing what's necessary, Greg. There's evidence that was ignored. Evidence that could prove James Lewis is innocent. Fisher chuckled darkly. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But this isn't your place. You're a judge, Marcus. You're supposed to enforce the law, not rewrite it. I'm not rewriting anything, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension. I'm correcting an injustice. And if you have a problem with that, then maybe you should ask yourself why you're so eager to keep this case buried. Fisher's voice hardened. You're playing a dangerous game, Marcus. If you keep this up, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of the law, and I won't hesitate to bring you down. Marcus didn't flinch. Do what you have to do, Greg, but I won't stop until I get to the truth. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt the weight of Fisher's threat pressing down on him. He knew that by pursuing this case, he was putting his career and his reputation on the line, but he had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The pressure continued to mount as Marcus and Sarah's investigation hit its first major roadblock. It happened on a cold, rainy afternoon. Sarah had been tracking down a key witness, Marita Collins, the woman who had lived next door to the convenience store that had been robbed the night James was arrested. Marita had given a vague statement during the original trial, but Sarah believed that she had seen more than she had let on. But when Sarah arrived at Marita's apartment, she found the door locked and the windows boarded up. A neighbor informed her that Marita had moved out of state weeks ago, leaving no forwarding address. That was our best lead, Sarah said over the phone later that evening, frustration thick in her voice. Without her, we're stuck. Marcus sat at his desk, running his hand through his hair. There has to be something else, some other piece of evidence we can use. Sarah sighed. We're running out of options, Marcus. And the longer this drags on, the more Fisher's going to tighten the screws. He's already putting pressure on my contacts, making it harder to get the information we need. Marcus felt a cold knot of anxiety settle in his stomach. He had known this would be difficult, but he hadn't expected it to feel so hopeless so soon. We'll find a way, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. We have to, Sarah replied, because if we don't, James is going to spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Just when things seemed darkest, an unexpected ally appeared. It happened late one night when Marcus was working late in his home office, going through the case files for the 100th time. A knock at the door startled him, and when he opened it, he was surprised to find Harold Harper, his old friend and fellow judge, standing on the doorstep. Harold, Marcus said, his voice filled with surprise. What are you doing here? Harold stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. I heard about what's been going on, about the Lewis case. Marcus's heart sank. He had been expecting criticism, maybe even a warning to back off. But to his surprise, Harold didn't look angry. He looked concerned. I thought you were going to tell me I'm making a mistake, Marcus said, closing the door behind him. Harold shook his head, his expression serious. I'm not here to lecture you, Marcus. I'm here to help. Marcus blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Help? Harold nodded. I've been doing some digging of my own. I found some things about Fisher, things that might explain why he's so determined to keep this case buried. He handed Marcus a folder, and as Marcus opened it, his eyes widened in shock. Inside were documents that detailed a pattern of misconduct in Fisher's office, evidence tampering, witness coercion, and a history of pushing for convictions, even when the evidence didn't support it. This is... Marcus began, struggling to find the words. It's enough to discredit Fisher's entire case against James, Harold said quietly. But you need to be careful. If Fisher finds out you have this, he'll come after you with everything he's got. Marcus looked up at Harold, gratitude and determination mixing in his chest. Why are you doing this? Harold gave him a small, sad smile. Because you're right, Marcus. Sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes we have to do more. The days following Harold's visit were a blur of frantic activity. Armed with the new information Harold had uncovered, Marcus and Sarah intensified their efforts. They began building a case not only to prove James's innocence, but to expose the corrupt practices that had landed him in prison in the first place. Every file they combed through, every piece of evidence they scrutinized, brought them one step closer to the truth, but also put them in greater danger. Marcus had never imagined the weight of the law he had faithfully upheld would now be used to crush him. Fisher was making good on his threats. Word had spread throughout the courthouse that Marcus was overstepping, that he was too close to the case, compromising his position as a judge. You've got to stop this, Harold had warned him during a tense phone call a few days after delivering the damning folder. You're pushing too far. Fisher's planning to take this to the Judicial Review Board. If you're not careful, he'll destroy your career. But Marcus couldn't stop. Something inside him, something deep, primal and long buried, wouldn't let him walk away. He had come too far. He had promised Mia and Eli that he would help them, and more than that, he had promised himself that he wouldn't let the system fail them the way it had failed others. Late one night, after another exhausting day, Marcus returned home to find Julia waiting for him in the living room. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on her face. We need to talk, Julia said, her voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of worry. Marcus hesitated at the doorway. He knew this conversation had been coming for a while, and yet he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready to face the toll this case had taken on his family, on his marriage. He crossed the room and sat down beside her, his hands clasped together as if he were preparing for a difficult ruling. I know you're doing what you think is right, Julia began, her voice gentle but firm. And I support you, Marcus. I always have. But I'm worried. You're losing yourself in this. You're putting everything on the line. Your career, your reputation, our life. Marcus stared at the floor, his mind swirling with the weight of her words. She was right. He had been consumed by this case, by the need to prove that justice could still be served, that the system could still work. But at what cost? I can't stop, Julia, Marcus said finally, his voice rough with emotion. If I walk away now, if I turn my back on Mia and Eli, then what kind of judge am I? What kind of man am I? Julia reached out and took his hand, her eyes soft with compassion. You're a good man, Marcus, but you're only one man. You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had always been the pillar of strength, the man who could handle anything, who never let his emotions get in the way. But now, for the first time in years, he feels vulnerable. What if I can't do this? Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. What if I fail them? Julia squeezed his hand, her voice steady. You won't, because even if you don't win this case, you've already shown them that someone cares. You've shown them that they matter, and that's more than enough. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Marcus had always thought of justice as something clear, something rigid, but now he was beginning to understand that justice was fragile, that it required both strength and compassion, and that sometimes it required sacrifice. As the investigation into James's case heated up, the town of Clarksville grew more divided. What had once been whispered gossip in the diner was now open debate on the streets. People were taking sides, some defending Marcus's actions, others calling for his removal from the bench. At the town's busiest coffee shop, the debate was fierce. You can't just have a judge deciding who gets a second chance based on their feelings. Tom Reynolds, the hardware store owner, argued, slamming his fist on the table for emphasis. The law is the law. If you break it, you pay the price. On the other side of the room, Clara Matthews spoke up, her voice firm but measured. And what about when the system makes a mistake, Tom? What if someone innocent is punished? You think that's justice? Marcus is trying to make things right, Tom scoffed. He's a judge, Clara, not a social worker. He's supposed to be impartial. This whole thing is turning into a circus. At the courthouse, Marcus faced increasing scrutiny. His fellow judges were wary, distancing themselves from him as if he had become a pariah. Even his longtime mentor, Judge Patricia Harlan, gave him a stern warning during a private meeting. "Marcus, you're making waves," Judge Harlan said, her voice cool and professional. "I've had complaints from several prominent figures in town, and Fisher's gunning for you. You need to step back. Let the process work." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his frustration barely contained. "The process is broken, Patricia. I've seen the evidence. I know James didn't get a fair trial. How can I step back when I know the system failed him?" Judge Harlan's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "I understand your passion, Marcus, but you're walking a fine line. If you keep pushing, you're going to end up losing everything. And for what? One case?" Marcus's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening with resolve. "It's not just one case, Patricia. It's about doing what's right." Judge Harlan sighed, her hands resting on the desk between them. "Be careful, Marcus. The world isn't as black and white as you think. Sometimes the hardest choice is knowing when to let go." Just when it seemed like the walls were closing in on Marcus, Sarah came through with a critical piece of evidence that changed everything. It happened one late afternoon when Marcus was on the verge of exhaustion, his hope dwindling as every lead they had followed seemed to fizzle out. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stacks of files, wondering if maybe Fisher was right. Maybe he was in over his head. The phone rang, and when he answered, Sarah's voice was breathless with excitement. "Marcus, I found her. Marita Johnson," Sarah said, barely able to contain her energy. "She was the neighbor of the store owner. She saw the robbery that night, and she's willing to talk. But that's not all. She says the man she saw wasn't James Lewis. She's been carrying this guilt for 2 years because she never spoke up." Marcus sat up straight, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where is she? When can we meet?" "Tomorrow morning," Sarah replied. "I've already arranged it. This could be the break we've been waiting for." The next morning, Marcus and Sarah met with Marita Johnson in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Marita was in her late 50s, her hair streaked with gray, and her hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she were afraid of being seen. "I should have come forward sooner," Marita said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew it wasn't James, but the police didn't care what I had to say. They had already decided he was guilty. And I was scared." Sarah leaned forward, her tone gentle but urgent. "What did you see that night, Marita?" Marita took a shaky breath. "I saw the man who robbed the store. He was tall, white, and thin. Nothing like James. He ran past my house after it happened, and I saw his face. But when I tried to tell the police, they just brushed me off, said it didn't matter." Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. How could they have ignored such a critical witness? How could they have let an innocent man go to prison while the real criminal walked free? "Will you testify?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Will you tell the court what you saw?" Marita hesitated, her fear palpable, but then she looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled with a kind of weary determination. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll testify. It's the least I can do." The courtroom was packed the day Marita Johnson took the stand. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire town had gathered to watch the final act of a long and painful drama unfold. Mia sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped together, her knuckles white with anxiety. Beside her, Eli sat quietly, his eyes wide with fear and hope. Marcus stood beside Sarah as they waited for the proceedings to begin. His heart raced, but his face remained calm and composed. This was the moment they had been working toward, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. The prosecutor, Gregory Fisher, was there too, his face tight with anger and frustration. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't happy about it. Marita took the stand, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible to swear the oath. She glanced nervously at the crowd, but when she looked at Marcus, he gave her a reassuring nod. Sarah began her questioning, her voice clear and confident. Mrs. Johnson, could you please tell the court what you saw the night of the robbery? Marita swallowed hard, then began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she told her story, she gained confidence. She described the man she had seen, the way he had run past her house, the details of his appearance that had been burned into her memory. "And was that man James Lewis?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Marita shook her head, her voice firm now. "It wasn't him. I know what I saw, and it wasn't James." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the weight of her words settled over the room. Fisher rose from his seat, his face a mask of cold fury. "Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant. The case has already been decided and—" The judge cut him off, raising a hand for silence. "Mr. Fisher, the testimony is relevant, given the new evidence that has come to light. I'll hear no more objections." Fisher's jaw clenched, but he sat down, knowing he had lost the battle. When the gavel finally came down, the ruling was clear. James Lewis's conviction was overturned, and he was to be released from prison immediately. The courtroom erupted into cheers, and Mia collapsed into tears, her relief overwhelming her. Eli hugged his mother tightly, his small face beaming with joy. Marcus stood at the front of the room, watching as Mia and Eli were finally reunited with James, who had been brought into the courtroom for the ruling. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a moment that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. The sun was setting behind the Clarksville courthouse when James Lewis walked free. The sky was streaked with gold and purple, casting long shadows on the steps where James stood, his family by his side. His face was pale and gaunt from the years behind bars, but his eyes were filled with relief. Mia clutched his arm, tears streaming down her face as Eli stood between them, his small hand wrapped tightly around his father's. A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, murmuring quietly as they watched the family's reunion. Reporters were already swarming the scene, cameras flashing, microphones being thrust toward anyone willing to speak. But at that moment, none of it mattered to James or Mia. They were together again, after years of pain and uncertainty. Marcus stood off to the side, watching from a distance. A part of him wanted to join the celebration, to bask in the joy of what they had accomplished. But another part of him, an older, more weary part, felt the weight of everything that had come before this moment. Sarah Donovan approached, her face flushed with excitement. "We did it, Marcus," she said, her voice barely containing her pride. "You did it." Marcus smiled faintly but said nothing. He couldn't shake the sense that this victory, as sweet as it was, had come at a cost. He had spent so long fighting for justice that he hadn't stopped to consider the toll it had taken on his own life, his career, and his family. As he watched James embrace his wife and son, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, relief, and something that felt like guilt. He had done the right thing, but the process had revealed cracks in a system he had once believed in so deeply. He had always seen himself as an upholder of the law, but now he saw that sometimes the law wasn't enough. That night back at home, Marcus sat in his darkened study, staring at the file that had consumed him for so many months. The case was closed now. James was free, and Fisher had been thoroughly discredited. But Marcus knew the fallout was far from over. The Judicial Review Board would meet in just a few days to determine whether Marcus could remain on the bench. Fisher had already filed complaints, citing Marcus's over-involvement in the Lewis case as evidence of bias. The board would decide whether Marcus had crossed the line, whether he had allowed his personal feelings to cloud his judgment. Julia entered the room quietly, sitting beside Marcus on the worn leather chair. She didn't speak, but the concern in her eyes said everything. "They'll probably take me off the bench," Marcus said after a long silence, his voice heavy. "Maybe not permanently, but at least for a while." Julia nodded, her hand reaching for him. "And what will you do?" Marcus sighed deeply. "I don't know. I've spent my entire life in that courtroom, believing in the law. But after this, after everything, I'm not sure if I can go back to the way things were." Julia studied him for a moment, her eyes soft but searching. "Maybe that's okay," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to do something else." Marcus looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What else can I do, Julia?" This is who I am. This is what I've built my life around." Julia smiled faintly, her hand squeezing his. "You're so much more than just a judge, Marcus. You've always fought for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. And you've shown that justice is about more than just the law. It's about compassion, about understanding. Maybe that's your path now." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, her words sinking in. He had spent so long defining himself by his position, by the authority he wielded as a judge, that he hadn't considered the possibility of a different kind of justice, a kind that didn't require a robe or a gavel. The day of the judicial review hearing arrived quickly, and Marcus entered the courthouse with a heavy heart. The grand hallways, once familiar and comforting, now felt cold and distant. As he made his way to the hearing room, whispers followed him, colleagues, lawyers, clerks, each of them curious about his fate. Inside the hearing room, Judge Patricia Harlan, chairwoman of the review board, sat at the head of a long table, her expression unreadable. Marcus had known her for years, respected her judgment and her commitment to the law, but today she would decide his future. The proceedings began with a formal reading of the charges against Marcus: breach of judicial impartiality, inappropriate involvement in an ongoing case, and conduct unbecoming of a judge. Gregory Fisher's complaint had been thorough, and his argument clear. Marcus had allowed his emotions to interfere with his duties. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his mind racing. This was his last chance to defend himself, to justify his actions. But as he stood before the board, he realized that he didn't need to defend what he had done. He believed in it, fully and without regret. "I won't deny that I became personally involved in the Lewis case," Marcus began, his voice steady but quiet. "And I understand that, as a judge, I'm expected to maintain impartiality at all times. But what I did, what I fought for, wasn't about bending the rules or undermining the law. It was about correcting an injustice." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with Patricia Harlan. "The law is meant to protect the innocent," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's meant to be a tool for justice, not a weapon to be used against the powerless. And when I saw the flaws in James Lewis's case, when I saw the system failing him, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I couldn't let an innocent man rot in prison while his family suffered." The room was silent as Marcus's words hung in the air. "I know my actions were unconventional," he said, his tone softening, "and I know that I've put my position as a judge in jeopardy. But if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Because I believe that justice is about more than following rules. It's about doing what's right." When he finished, Marcus sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. The board deliberated for what felt like hours, leaving Marcus to sit in agonizing silence. Every moment stretched out, each second heavier than the last. Finally, the door opened, and Judge Harlan returned. Her face is still unreadable. She stood at the head of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "After careful consideration, the board has reached a decision," she said, her voice even. "We acknowledge that Judge Marcus Williams acted outside the traditional bounds of his role. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the clear injustice in the case of James Lewis, we believe his actions, while unorthodox, were not without merit." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as Judge Harlan continued. "Therefore, the board has decided that Judge Williams will be suspended from the bench for a period of 6 months, during which time he will undergo further review and evaluation. However, we do not find cause for permanent removal from his position." The gavel came down, and the decision was final. Marcus exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had been given a second chance, one that came with consequences, but a chance nonetheless. The suspension was both a punishment and a relief. For 6 months, Marcus was free from the pressures of the courtroom, free from the strict rules and regulations that had defined his life for so long. At first, the absence of structure felt disorienting, like a man untethered from his moorings. But slowly, Marcus began to find his way. He spent more time with Julia, reconnecting with the woman who had stood by him through it all. They took long walks in the park, shared quiet dinners, and talked about things other than the law. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was rediscovering the parts of himself he had buried beneath the weight of his career. But even as he settled into this new rhythm, Marcus knew he couldn't walk away from justice entirely. The case had changed him, opened his eyes to the cracks in the system, and he couldn't ignore that. He didn't want to return to the bench bound by the limitations of the law. He wanted to do something different, something that would allow him to fight for the people who had been forgotten. It was during one of his long walks with Julia that the idea came to him. "What if I started something new?" Marcus said one evening as they strolled through the quiet streets of Clarksville. Julia looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "A legal advocacy group," Marcus explained, his voice growing more animated. "Something that would help people like James, people who've been wrongfully convicted, who don't have the resources to fight back. I've spent my whole life enforcing the law, but now I want to be part of something that challenges it, that fixes the mistakes." Julia smiled softly, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Marcus. You've always fought for what's right. Now you can do it on your own terms." A few months later, Marcus and Sarah opened the doors to the Clarksville Justice Initiative, a small but ambitious legal advocacy center dedicated to helping the wrongfully convicted and those caught in the cracks of the justice system. The office was modest, 2 small rooms in a refurbished building downtown, but it was filled with purpose and determination. Word spread quickly through the town, and soon people from all over the state began seeking out their help. Marcus and Sarah worked tirelessly, poring over case files, interviewing witnesses, and finding the evidence that had been missed or ignored in trial after trial. Each case was a new challenge, but it was a challenge Marcus welcomed. One afternoon, Mia and James came by the office to say thank you. James had found work at a local construction company, and Mia was back at the diner. But their lives had changed in more ways than they could have imagined. They were free to live, free to raise their son, free to build a future that had once seemed impossible. "We owe you everything," Mia said, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "You gave us our lives back." Marcus smiled, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, Mia. You fought just as hard as I did, and now you get to build the life you deserve." Eli, who had grown taller in the months since James's release, ran up to Marcus with a handmade card. It was simple, with colorful crayon drawings of their family, and Marcus standing beside them. "Thank you for bringing my daddy home," Eli said, his voice filled with innocence and warmth. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he looked down at the card, the simple gesture reminding him of why he had fought so hard in the first place. At this moment, this family was what justice looked like. Not the cold, rigid structure of the law, but the warmth of compassion and the fierce determination to make things right. Years later, the Clarksville Justice Initiative grew from a small local organization to a well-known advocacy group with national recognition. Marcus and Sarah continued their work, expanding their team and taking on more complex cases that challenged the very foundations of the justice system. Marcus no longer wore the robes of a judge, but in many ways, he had never felt more like a true advocate for justice. The work was hard, sometimes grueling, but it was meaningful in a way that went beyond anything he had experienced in the courtroom. As he sat at his desk one afternoon, reviewing the files of a new case, Marcus paused to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The choices he had made, the risks, the sacrifices, they had all led to this moment. And while the road had been long and filled with obstacles, he knew he had found his true calling. Because in the end, justice wasn't about following the letter of the law. It was about fighting for the people who needed it most. And that was a fight Marcus Williams would never stop. As the sun set on another day at the Clarksville Justice Initiative, Marcus Williams stood at the office window, looking out at the town he had fought so hard to protect. The journey had been long and difficult, but each victory, each life changed, made it all worth it. The fight for justice was far from over. If you believe in standing up for what's right, for fighting against injustice and making a real difference, make sure you subscribe and follow along. There are so many more stories like Marcus's and James's out there. Stories of people who need their voices heard, and we're just getting started. Join us as we continue this journey of justice, compassion, and redemption. Click the subscribe button and be part of a community that believes in making the world a better place, one case at a time. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on stories like this. Let's keep fighting for what's right together.